Hello and welcome to Top Class with me, Duncan Crawford, where we're discussing how teachers and schools can cope in the face of natural disasters. Everyone will have seen the wildfires raging in Los Angeles, which began over a week ago. Over 12,000 homes, businesses and other structures have been destroyed, with more than 100,000 people forced to evacuate. At the time of the recording of this podcast, on Wednesday the 15th of January, at least 25 people had died in the disaster. Amongst the burnt-out wreckage of buildings, schools have also been badly affected. Hundreds of schools across LA County were closed last week due to the blaze, affecting more than 400,000 students. However, most schools reopened 2 days ago on Monday. For some students, though, their schools were destroyed in the blaze. How should educators respond in a time of crisis such as this? There are so many challenges and issues to dig into. I'm glad to say I'm joined by Developmental-Behavioural Paediatrician David Schonfeld, the director of the National Centre for School Crisis and Bereavement at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, which helps children and communities deal with trauma and grief. He's carried out extensive research on how children cope with death, is an author and also the chair of the National Advisory Committee on Children and Disasters. Thank you so much for joining me, David.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, David, you live in LA. You've been personally affected by the fires, like so many others. You were forced to evacuate from your home. What's the past week been like for you?
Well, we live very close to Eaton Canyon, so only about 5 or 6 blocks from the edge of the fire there. And so we did have to evacuate pretty urgently when the fire first started, and we were gone for about a week. But we've gotten back into our home. We're one of the lucky ones, so now we're just here. But we continue to be on evacuation alert. So we have a go bag, which we repacked last night, and we're ready to leave if the fire spreads further with the high winds that they're predicting.
And like you say, you're one of the lucky ones in that respect, because obviously whole neighbourhoods have gone up in flames. It is shocking to see. What's it been like seeing the neighbourhoods you live in go up in smoke?
So yeah, literally it was smoky. And the initial phone call was from a next door neighbor who thought the flames had reached to the street just behind us. And part of it is because some of that was on the mountain. So when a mountain is in flame, it looks like you see flames over the houses right behind you. You also have to realize that there was very heavy winds. They went up to 99 miles per hour in our area. And so there were a lot of palm fronds and tree branches, and streets were obstructed. And so the traffic was a little more difficult getting out. But it also brings community members together. So we've been checking in on our neighbors even when we were evacuated. People do come together to help each other. So there's a lot of kind of sharing. But you also share some of the grief that people have. The Altadena, which is where the fire hit worse in the Eaton Canyon area. My wife used to work there. It's very close to where we live. So the hardware store we go to is no longer there anymore. And so there are a lot of losses. But from my perspective, those losses, they kind of accumulate over time. You start to realize what you've lost as you continue the recovery path. So I have kind of, since I do this work, I kind of just reminded my wife, let's just focus on what we need to do now to help ourselves and those we know and care about and can assist. We'll come back later to some of the grief that we've had or will have over what we've lost. But I guess at least I have that perspective from having worked with so many communities that have been devastated by natural disasters that I guess I do get more quickly to we're safe. That's what's most important. Let's take care of the needs that friends and family have and that we have.
Speaking about the emotional impact, emotionally from the teachers and students and school staff you've spoken to, how are people coping?
Well, it's quite variable. I was mentioning this to someone yesterday, that when you have wildfires like this, they affect certain areas with often complete devastation, other areas with just damage, and then many other areas look just fine and things go back to usual to a large degree. And that is actually part of the challenge because what happens is if your home is just a foundation and ashes and you've lost everything you have and A lot of people, I don't think, were fully insured. Actually, fire insurance is separate here, and it's pretty expensive, and it doesn't do complete coverage. And I think a lot of people just let it lapse. And so as a result, there's some people who have kind of literally lost all of their financial resources. And they are not that far from parts of the community that are open again. Concerts are back, shows are back, restaurants are open, mere blocks away from where some of the devastation is. And for those people, they may feel that they've been forgotten, that they've been neglected, and actually not trying to talk about bad things. But what we do find is that in some communities that have had natural disasters, weeks to some months afterwards, there is an increase in suicide among the adults. And so some people who have been really severely impacted start to feel like everyone else is back to normal and I'm not, and there's something wrong with me. So I do think that the level of impact is highly variable. So you're going to have some kids in a school who really they had no damage. They weren't afraid at the time. They didn't know there was anything wrong when the fire started. And they really are more concerned about, getting their grades up to be able to apply to elite colleges, trying to have their concerts, their athletic events, regular life. And then there's some kids there who are displaced, evacuated, really have parents who are highly distressed, who either lost their homes or their jobs, and don't know what their future is going to be, and don't know whether or not they'll even be able to stay in the region. And so if you're a teacher and you're trying to teach students who have such divergent experiences, while you also have your own experiences, and then you have all of the other life challenges going on at the same time.
Let's try to go through some of those different scenarios involving people who've been affected in different ways. For students or teachers who've literally lost everything, what do you recommend for getting back to normal, in inverted commas? Should school even be a consideration at this point for some of those people?
Well, I was talking to one of the schools that was deeply impacted and where school buildings had been damaged, and they were like, well, we need more time. They shouldn't open schools this quickly. And I said, but you have children who are perhaps in homes that were fire damaged, where the parents and adults in the household are trying to clean up, rebuild, try and recover what they can from the building. And you don't want the children there. It's not safe if there's been fire damage. And they don't have any place to put their kids because a lot of the neighbors are also impacted. So it's not that they can go just next door. And so school opening up is a safe and familiar and supportive environment, and you want that as soon as possible for kids who have lost their homes, for example. School also provides a lot of essential services such as healthcare, food for people who have food instability. That's sometimes where they get one or two of their meals for the day. It's also where they often get mental health support. So you want them back in school as quickly as possible, but then you have to realize that the staff went through the same event, and so often they're as impacted, if not more impacted. I mean, I've been to schools that have had, wildfires, and the principal of the school, his home was destroyed, and he's sleeping on the couch of someone, and at the same time, he's trying to rebuild the school and support all the students and staff. It's enormous, the amount of burden that some of the administrators and educators experience. But we do want schools open as soon as it is safe and practical. And then we just have to make sure we provide as much as possible support to the educators, all of the educators in the schools, so that they can take care of themselves and do the work that they need to do.
You already mentioned the risk of suicide. For students, some of whom will have lost their homes, maybe lost loved ones, what kind of emotional, psychological support can students be offered at this time? And should they be going back to school early? I know you said generally they should, but for someone in that situation?
Yeah. So first off, the comment that I made about suicide is more in adults. So we don't see that phenomenon in children as much. I haven't seen it reported, but I have seen that with some adults. The issue is that those adults may be family members of children in the school, and they also are members of the community. Suicide is the second leading cause of death among children 10 to 24 years of age in the United States. And as a result, suicide is always a concern, but I don't anticipate that going up in children from the wildfires. But from adults, it can occur. And so you really need to be thoughtful about the emotional impact of these events on both the children and adults and not dismiss it as this is the new normal, because this is not normal. The weather that we're having is not normal, and the wildfires, although they do occur, are not a normal expected experience for most people. But in terms of what you can provide for kids, number one, you have to acknowledge that they're having this impact. If children are sitting there in class not sure where they're going to be sleeping that night, or they don't have their computer anymore, their laptop at home, or maybe they're staying someplace else and they don't have access to Wi-Fi in the same way. You have to make adjustments in the homework and the academic expectations of students so that the work doesn't exceed their current capacity to learn. If you exceed that capacity, even temporarily, then school becomes a burden to children, but we really need it to be a supportive environment. So number one is you have to talk about the fact that it is difficult and that you are here to provide support and assistance. And so sometimes you have to slow down the academic pace so that you meet children where they're at. Children don't come to school on a typical day with equal capacity to learn. We call it differentiated learning. Some children have certain strengths and other children have challenges in their learning, and emotional aspects can burden children all the time in schools. But I always say it's like differentiated learning on steroids. So part of what you're going to see is wide disparities. And so an educator has to try and meet most children where there are and make accommodations and provide additional academic support for those who need or would benefit from more of it. So you have to start that conversation. But again, you have to realize that the educator may also be personally struggling with their own emotional needs and their own basic needs. I remember I went to one school that had a large natural disaster, and the principal's home was destroyed. And there also were deaths in the community, and the school had some damage. So there was a lot going on, and the school was just reopening. A lot of this natural disaster had happened just as school was ending the year before, so there was a summer in between. But I was there, and I was talking to the principal, and I just asked, "How are you doing?" And she said, "My house was destroyed." And so I said, "So where are you living?" And she said, "I'm living in my mother's basement." And I was like, "And how is that going for you?" And she was really a very nice person. She just looked at me. She said, "There were very legitimate reasons I moved out of my mother's home to begin with. They persist today." And so I was like, "Well, what are you doing about that to find a home?" So she just said, "Well, there's very limited housing stock. And right before this happened, I got divorced. So I don't really have a partner to help me with this." And so she looked at me and she said, "What type of a message would it deliver to my staff if I was not in school during this time and I was out looking for a home for myself?" And I said, "It would deliver the message that you care about professional self-care and you're setting a model for taking care of your basic needs. And that's what you need to model for your staff." So I think that's part of what happens is you have to realize they have enormous pressures to begin with. And when they're natural disasters, sometimes it really exceeds a lot more than you can imagine. And we really need to make sure we take care of the adults.
Will staff who've lost their homes in the current situation be expected to come back to work in schools? Because as you say, they might be homeless, they could have lost all their belongings. But will the school understand in that scenario if teachers don't come back to work, which means the teachers aren't available for the students who, like you say, are in a situation where they need support as well?
Part of what you have to realize is that in our communities right now, we had hundreds of thousands of people had to evacuate. So my situation is not that unusual at all right now in the community. And you could say the same thing about me. Am I expected to tape a podcast? Am I expected to go do a presentation tomorrow at a school? But this is what we do. This is our career. And so to be quite honest, you don't really want to sit in a shelter and do nothing. So being able to help others is part of the way that you help yourself. So to the extent that you can go back and help others, it's actually quite enabling of recovery. So part of what we say to schools is make it clear that you don't require people to come back, but that you are going to be opening school for those who are able to return. But a lot of what I hear, whether it's after a school shooting or a natural disaster, I have had, this is particularly among elementary school teachers, they will say things like, we cannot open school unless I am there to take care of the babies. Like I've had teachers refer to their students as babies, like they feel like they have to be there to support them. People go into education not for the money, prestige, power, or convenience, but because they really care about children. So you could say, well, they should just stay home until they've got everything in place. But number one, they're devoted to their students, as we really want them to be. And it isn't helpful for most people to do nothing. It just really makes them feel like they have no personal value. But I find that most people talk about the heroic acts that people make. And there are situations where people provide, really selfless service to others and think of the needs of others. But to be quite honest, most people are suffering during these situations and they're not at their best. And people say it brings out the best in you. In most cases, it doesn't. It actually brings out your distress. And people tend to become a little more self-centered, a little more self-focused, often irritable. And so that's the other thing you have to think about is that the people you're interacting with are not necessarily doing their best. And we're not necessarily doing our best. So sometimes we're struggling, and that impacts how we interact. So you put all those kids and all those staff into a building. And so, yes, there's a lot of coming together in community, but there's also a lot of conflict that you'll see. And so it's a complicated scenario.
I should explain to people that your centre has been dealing with these crises for decades, all kinds of disasters from COVID-19 to school shootings, to floods, earthquakes, hurricanes, you name it. Are there lessons or ways for teachers and schools to handle things which are common across all these different kinds of crises?
Yeah. So one of the things that I do like to point out is we as a society, at least in the United States, have really moved a lot to kind of have what we call being trauma informed. So people are kind of more aware of the impact of trauma on people and certain strategies to try and support people who have been through traumatic experiences. The issue is that we tend to start talking about anything bad that happens as if it was traumatic. And trauma, there may be certain components of what happens in wildfires that are related to trauma. So for example, if you're evacuating your home and you have what we call life threat at the time, you're stuck in traffic, you see flames behind you, you're afraid that you might perish, then that is a traumatic experience, and you may have post-traumatic reactions and post-traumatic stress as a result. But for most of the people that evacuated, including myself, for example, I actually was not worried that we would die as we were evacuating our house. I just was pretty worried that our house wouldn't be there when we got back, because the fire was not far away, and for days it was 0% contained. And the margin of where the wildfire was expanding pretty rapidly and very close to where we live. And I thought at one point that maybe our house was included in that. What I was actually then experienced was grief. So grief is more of the sense of how you experience loss. And so the way we experience grief is very different than the way that we experience trauma. And the way that we deal with and recover from grief is also quite different. So the example that I often use is I was talking to a teenager. He was in a mass shooting, and the person on either side of him was shot and killed, but he was not physically injured. And so he went back to school once within the next couple weeks, but only stayed an hour. and he declined any counseling. So I went to his home and I asked him, why aren't you getting counseling? And he said, they want to keep talking about the shooting. And I don't want to talk about that anymore. And he said, look, I had some trauma symptoms. I was jittery. I felt unsafe. I couldn't sleep well. That lasted about a week, and that's no longer an issue. And I said, well, then why aren't you in school? And he said, I went back to school and it didn't feel right being there without her. He was on a date with the girl he planned on marrying, and she was killed. She was one of the people on his side who was killed. And he said, being in school without her didn't feel right. And I said, well, maybe you're grieving the death of your girlfriend. And he just went silent, thought about it, and he said, that's it. And if someone's ready to talk to me about that, I'll go for counseling today. I don't want to keep talking about the shooting. So I think the thing was everyone was focused on the traumatic experience. He was in one of the largest mass casualty events in the country. I'm sure there was a very high risk of him having long-term post-traumatic reactions. Very appropriate to ask about what happened that day and how he was adjusting to it. But that wasn't really what was bothering him. What was bothering him was not what happened that day, but rather the absence of someone he loved for the rest of his life. And the way we deal with grief is just much different. So part of it is to acknowledge that in situations like this, it is not all trauma. It is often grief.
I want to talk about how to maintain the continuity of education in disasters such as the wildfires. What can schools do to continue education when school buildings are damaged or destroyed?
Well, and continuity of education is important. Curricula vary widely between schools, and classroom educators have different teaching styles. So what you want to do is, to the extent possible, keep the students with their teacher. Now, that might mean that the entire school has to evacuate together, or it may mean that if the child has, let's say the building isn't damaged, but the child's home is damaged. I was on the National Commission on Children Disasters about a decade ago or more. And one of the things that we did was we went to a community that had had a large natural disaster and did kind of a hearing in the community. And one of the things that came up was that a lot of the school wasn't damaged, but a lot of the students had to move into other communities. And so what the school was doing on its own was busing children from other communities so they could remain with their class and with their teachers. And the reason I mentioned I was on the National Commission was I had a FEMA administrator next to me, and they said, FEMA will reimburse that. That is an allowable expense. The school was doing it at their own expense, but it is allowable, or at least was at that time. So part of it was that what we find is that schools should try and maintain the educational continuity by keeping students in classes that they were in to the extent they can. This also happens if let's say you have a single parent and that parent dies and they have to go live with a grandparent 2 towns away. Schools will often say, you are still welcome to be our student for the rest of the school year. During this time of a great stress, we don't want to add the stress of you being in a different school. But sometimes natural disasters force families to relocate throughout the country. When Katrina happened, there was one school that was had to close because of damage to the building. It was actually a school for gifted students. So these were really bright students who were in a school for gifted children in the community. And they dispersed across the country for at least several months. And I know one of the students became so kind of depressed by it that the school that accepted him thought that he actually had an intellectual developmental disorder. And so they placed him into full-time special education for intellectually handicapped children. And he, of course, didn't pay attention to that and did worse and worse. And I don't know why they didn't realize he was actually intellectually gifted. But anyway, he struggled a great deal in special ed. And then the school reopened. He moved back to New Orleans and went back to the school for gifted students. So the issue is that you really have to try and keep kids in their regular learning environment to the extent that's practical, but sometimes that is impossible in really large-scale disasters.
Who leads those initiatives? Because there must be so many logistics involved. You mentioned Hurricane Katrina there, but finding the classroom space, finding the transportation so the kids can get to school, how that impacts on the students in the school where extra students are coming in and how they all fit in the classroom. I mean, who manages that?
Well, typically that's managed by the school administrators who may not have any real training or experience in dealing with disasters. So I went to one school district that was very close to New Orleans. They had the most displaced students. They doubled their student population in 1 week. But they didn't double their budget. They didn't double their space. They didn't double their staffing. So they just had to absorb all of these students. And the students were struggling. And many of them didn't, they registered for school, but they didn't show up for months. And so part of what I had to say to them was, look, I'm worried about the students that you see struggling, but I'm more worried about the ones you haven't even met. And what are you doing for active outreach? They're in trailer parks. There was a lot of substance use, domestic violence, suicide in these trailer parks. So it's not like they were having fun there. And if they're not coming to school, it's because they're scared. So school avoidance is one of the main reactions that we see. And so you really need to go out and provide the support so kids can come to school. And I remember the administrator looked at me and said, "Oh, we are struggling to take care of the kids that are showing up. Please tell me we don't have to go get the others." And I just said, well, you don't have to, but they're eventually going to show up and they'll be even more behind and have even more emotional distress. And the administrator looked at me and said, "Of course we're going to go get them. That's not a question. That's a moral imperative. I'm just kind of struggling to find out, as bad as it is, it's actually, there's much more that we haven't even seen yet." So I think part of it, what we try and do is work with schools, work with administrators, work with their staff to try and help them feel better prepared, to be empathic and supportive to students, to know what to say and what not to say, and to know how to provide the learning supports and the academic accommodations so kids can do the best that they can under difficult circumstances.
So following the wildfires in LA, would you expect then an increase in dropout rates? And if yes, then what should school administrators be doing now proactively to try and mitigate that situation?
So yes, dropout rates do go up. So I was telling people, we were working with New York City schools, for example, prior to the pandemic. By, I think, April, within a month and a half, we were already doing training virtually for educators in New York City schools, right when it was the epicenter. And I said to them then, you can anticipate that as soon as this virus is under control, you will have students who don't return to school. Even if we were able to eliminate the virus, which we won't be able to do, and even if we could give 100% assurance that they won't get infected, which we won't be able to do, but even if you did, there will be a number of children who won't come back. And so you need to now reach out to students and connect with them while they're home. You need to provide good communication and information about how the school is safe and how to provide support as you reopen school. And you need to do outreach for the ones that don't return. And so what people are seeing now is there's still a drop in enrollment, more than 4 years after the pandemic. This was all predicted. And so we see the same thing after wildfires. And what you will get is, I think it's better to homeschool. I think, we were out for a period of time and we already started homeschooling, so we'd like to continue it. But a lot of times it's that kids do not want to be separated from those that care for them and that they care about after a disaster, for fear that something will happen to them if their parents or guardians aren't there to protect them, or something may happen to their parents, guardians, or siblings if they aren't somehow there to protect them. So what happens is people tend to stay close when there's been a disaster, and the parents, they don't want their kids to leave either. They worry that something might occur and they want to be with them as much as possible. So I'm doing a presentation for one of the schools tomorrow for parents and caregivers. How do you support your kids for the wildfire in one of the communities most impacted by the wildfire here? And so that's part of what you do. Start talking with caregivers, start expressing what the school is doing to support students and what it will do to support the caregivers as well. And then ask, what are your concerns? What are your worries? Let's talk about how to make those accommodations. But the impact of these events are not measured in weeks or months. They're measured in years.
What long-term impacts then do you predict for education due to these wildfires? Will there be learning gaps as a result?
There will be learning impact. So I think there was some research done after brush fires in Australia, for example, that found that elementary school students on standardized testing were still showing some gaps 3 to 4 years after the wildfires. You do see, long-term impacts. There is a tendency for us, though, to always express what we have lost through disasters. It's very understandable, and it has negative impacts. But we are changed by these experiences, but we're not necessarily damaged. And I think that's part of what I don't like about some of the discussion about trauma, is that we talk about how it has, it rewires the brain. It leads to it shortens your lifespan. It increases your chance of heart disease as an adult, major stressors. And while that is all true, we are not necessarily all damaged by these events, but we are all different. So there is a phenomenon called post-traumatic growth, where people may actually emerge from disasters or crisis events with new resiliency, newfound abilities to value certain things in their life. I was talking about post-traumatic growth to a group of foster parents after a large-scale natural disaster. And one of the parents said, "You know what? I think I had post-traumatic growth." And I asked him what happened. So this was on the East Coast. He worked on Wall Street. He was successful on Wall Street, was making a lot of money. He was married. He was young. He had a toddler. He said, "I thought I was doing perfect. Like everything was working. I had money. I had success. I had a loving wife. I had a baby I loved." The baby got sick and died. And so he started to question everything about his life. And he said, and I questioned even my career. And I realized a career is something that makes the world a better place. And he said, I make money for people who have money. It's a job. It's not really a career. I'm not really changing the world to make it a better place. And he said, so he quit his successful job on Wall Street and went back to college to become a kindergarten teacher. He said, shaping the life of a young child, that's a career. So, and then he became a foster parent, and he was about to adopt a young child. And he asked, is that post-traumatic growth? And I said, yes, it is. The challenge with post-traumatic growth is that those who have been through trauma and loss often have feelings associated resurface when they go to help others. That's part of what occurs. And so when you deal with a disaster, you're not just dealing with what happened in that disaster. You're dealing with what happened in the lives of everyone who's lived through that disaster. So that's why increasingly what we're doing is professional self-care, helping helpers figure out how to take care of themselves, not just in the practical things like get a good night's sleep, eat well, and exercise, but really other things about how do you deal with the impact of witnessing distress in others? How do you deal with the feelings that this unsurfaces in yourself? How do you prevent moral injury? How do you minimize vicarious traumatization? How do you kind of minimize the risk of compassion fatigue? We have to kind of help people become more aware of both the value of what they provide in these disasters, but also the challenges that it brings for themselves so that they stay in their careers and they're healthy. Because that's another thing that you see is a turnover of staff. And so we really need to be sure that we're, taking care of the kids and the adults and the families, because this is part of our reality, these disasters, and they are increasing in frequency and in scale.
You mentioned that disasters like the wildfires are becoming more frequent, more common. What steps can schools take to prepare for natural disasters like this in the future, given that many are predicting they are going to become much more frequent?
Well, there's a number of things. Obviously, there's certain physical, structural things that they can do so that they're prepared if the natural disaster happens while the students are there, so that they can safely evacuate. I've worked, we worked with Joplin after the tornadoes. They're in tornado-prone areas, so you have to think about What do you do if there is a tornado while the kids are at school? There's those kind of practical issues, and those are important. But I'm assuming you're asking more about what do you do for emotional support. So part of it is you really need to build a robust school climate and culture where you attend to the psychosocial needs of students and staff on a routine basis. Because you don't want to just be supportive after there's been a natural disaster. You need to be supportive prior. And so the issue is if families know that the one place I can go where I will always be valued and cared about and cared for is my school, then they're more likely to turn to them after a disaster for that type of support. So we need to create that culture and climate. We need to also try and train educators so they know principles of psychological first aid. How do you talk to people and support people when they have distress? Because kids come to school distressed every day, even when there isn't a natural disaster. And how do you make academic accommodations and provide academic supports to people who have distressing things happening in their lives? These are skill sets they should be part of teacher preparation courses. I mean, when I started this like 35 years ago, and I remember people saying, well, I never knew that, I'd have to support a kid that's grieving. I'm like, 90% of children experience the death of someone close to them by the time they finish high school. I don't understand why you never thought that might happen in your class. So the issue comes, don't educators realize that sometimes kids are upset? And how do we deal with that? So I think it just has to be part of the training and the preparation of educators of all groups. Everyone needs to know, how can you create a school environment that respects, honors, and supports students? So some of that's called psychological first aid. You can train people in that. It's quite basic information. It doesn't require a mental health degree or much training to be able to do. And we should make sure that all educators are able to do that.
Okay, thank you so much for speaking to me. That was Dr. David Schonfeld, the Director of the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. David, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me, particularly given your current personal and work situation. It is very much appreciated, and I hope the wildfires are soon contained, and of course do stay safe as well. If you like this podcast, then please subscribe. You don't want to miss out on any future episodes. You can also check out some of the old episodes, including one on how to support teacher well-being, which is at least partially relevant to the conversation which we've just had. For now, though, that is it. Thanks again to David, and I hope you join us again soon for another episode of Top Class. All the best.
Thank you.